What if the greatest war in human history was never recorded? What if the conflict that shaped everything, that ended one age and began another, was so catastrophic, so complete in its destruction, that almost nothing survived to tell the story? Not a war between nations, not a war between kings, a war between giants. Long before the first pharaoh sat on the throne of Egypt, long before the first stone was laid at Sumer or Babylon, long before any civilization we recognize left its mark on the earth, something else was here, something powerful, something ancient, something that our earliest ancestors could only describe in the language of gods and monsters. Two forces, two civilizations, both extraordinary beyond anything that came after them. Both possessing knowledge and power that the entire span of recorded human history has never managed to replicate. And according to the oldest traditions on Earth, traditions separated by oceans and centuries and cultures that had no contact with each other, these two forces met, they clashed, and the world was never the same again. One was born of forbidden union, the offspring of divine beings who descended to Earth and intermingled with humanity, producing a race of giants who walked among men as gods, beings of terrifying strength and forbidden knowledge, who ruled the ancient world through power and fear and a mastery of forces that human science is only beginning to rediscover. The other was the greatest civilization the pre-flood world ever produced, a society of such breathtaking sophistication that even its memory, preserved in fragments, distorted by millennia of retelling, has haunted human imagination for 2,500 years. The Nephilim, and the Atlanteans, and between them, a war that may have ended the world. To understand what happened, we have to go back to the very beginning, back to a time before the flood, back to a world that was, by every ancient account, radically different from the one we inhabit today. The Book of Enoch is one of the most extraordinary texts in the entire corpus of ancient literature. Written long before the canonical Bible took its final form, quoted directly by the Apostle Jude, referenced throughout early Christian and Jewish theology, and then, for reasons that remain deeply suspicious, removed from the official canon and suppressed for nearly 2,000 years. Why? What does the Book of Enoch contain that made it so dangerous? The answer is in the opening chapters. The Watchers, a class of divine beings, 200 of them, led by a figure named Semyaza, descended to Earth on Mount Hermon. They took human women as wives. They produced children, and those children were not human. They were the Nephilim, giants. The text is specific about their size, 300 cubits tall in some translations, though ancient measurements varied. But the consistency across multiple ancient sources is unmistakable. These were beings of extraordinary physical scale. More than their size, it was their knowledge that made them dangerous. The Watchers didn't just interbreed with humanity, they transferred to their offspring, and through them to early human civilization, a catalog of forbidden sciences. Azazel taught the making of weapons and armor, the crafting of swords and knives and shields, the art of war at a scale humanity had never known. Semyaza taught enchantments and the cutting of roots, the manipulation of natural forces. Armoros taught the resolving of enchantments. Barakiel taught astrology. Kokabeel taught the knowledge of the clouds. Tamiel taught the movement of the stars. Azradel taught the path of the moon, astronomy, meteorology, military technology, the secret workings of the natural world. All of it poured into a pre-flood civilization through the Nephilim and their Watcher fathers. The result was a world transformed. Early humanity, which had been developing slowly, suddenly found itself in possession of knowledge it had no framework to process. Technologies it couldn't fully control, power it wasn't ready to wield, and the Nephilim themselves, half divine, half human, all power, became the rulers of this transformed world. Not through consent, not through wisdom or justice, through dominance, through the simple, overwhelming fact of their physical and intellectual superiority. Ancient texts describe the Nephilim as tyrants, as beings who consumed the resources of the earth without restraint, who turned on humanity with violence when humanity could no longer sustain their appetites. The Book of Enoch describes them devouring the food supplies of human communities, then turning to consume humans directly, then turning on each other. A world spiraling toward catastrophe. A world crying out, according to the ancient text, to the heavens for relief. Now let's turn to the other side of this equation, because while the Nephilim dominated the lands we know, the ancient Near East, the regions around the Mediterranean, the territories that would eventually become the cradles of recorded civilization, another power was rising somewhere else. Or perhaps not rising, perhaps already ancient by the time the Nephilim reached their height. Perhaps already in possession of a civilization so advanced, so sophisticated, so complete, that it was the one thing in the pre-flood world that could stand against them. Plato recorded the story of Atlantis in two dialogues, the Timaeus and the Critias, written around 360 BC. He was explicit about his source. The story came through the Athenian statesman Solon, who had received it from Egyptian priests at Say during his visit to Egypt around 590 BC. And the Egyptian priests were equally explicit. This was not mythology. This was history. Recorded in the temple archives of Egypt, preserved across thousands of years, passed down through the priestly tradition with the specific insistence that it was true. The priests told Solon that Athens itself was far older than the Greeks knew. That 9,000 years before their conversation, placing the events around 9600 BC, there had been a great civilization in the Atlantic Ocean. An island continent of extraordinary size, situated beyond the Pillars of Hercules, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar. This civilization, Atlantis, was powerful beyond anything in the known world. Its capital city was a marvel of engineering, concentric rings of land and water connected by canals, topped with temples sheathed in metals that glowed in the sunlight. Orichalcum, a metal the ancient Greeks knew about but could not identify with certainty, covered the walls of the central temple, gleaming like fire. The Atlanteans controlled territory across much of the known world. They had established colonies or dominions in parts of Europe and North Africa. Their military power was unmatched. Their technology was generations ahead of anything that existed elsewhere. But here is what Plato's account makes absolutely clear, and what is almost always overlooked in popular discussions of Atlantis. The Atlanteans were not entirely human either. Plato is explicit. The Atlanteans were the descendants of the god Poseidon and a mortal woman named Cleito. Their founding bloodline was divine human hybrid. Their first kings, the sons of Poseidon himself, possessed powers and capabilities that no purely human lineage could match. Over generations, Plato tells us, the divine element in the Atlantean bloodline was diluted. The human nature grew stronger. And as it did, the Atlanteans became corrupted. They became greedy, aggressive, imperial. They extended their reach, conquered more territory, and eventually, according to Plato, made the catastrophic decision to attack Athens and Egypt. Now hold that thought, because here is where the two traditions, the Nephilim and the Atlanteans, begin to converge in ways that cannot be explained by coincidence. Both civilizations trace their origins to a union between divine beings and human women. Both possessed extraordinary knowledge and technology. Both are described as eventually becoming corrupt, violent, and imperialistic. Both are connected to a catastrophic flood that ended their civilizations. And both leave behind mysteries, archaeological, genetic, geological, that mainstream science cannot fully explain. The timeline is critical. If we take Plato's dating seriously, and the Egyptian priests insisted it was accurate, then Atlantis reached its height and fell around 9600 BC. This places the events squarely within the period that many researchers identify as the end of the last ice age, a time of genuinely catastrophic global change, rising sea levels, massive flooding events, the disappearance of entire land masses beneath the ocean. This is also, in the broad mythological timeline preserved across dozens of ancient cultures, the period associated with the Great Flood. The event described in Genesis, the event described in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the event described in Hindu texts, in Mesoamerican traditions, in the oral histories of indigenous peoples from Australia to the Americas. Every major ancient culture has a flood story. Every one of those flood stories describes a catastrophic global event that destroyed a previous world and reset human civilization. What if the flood wasn't just a natural disaster? What if it was the consequence of a war? Consider what both the Book of Enoch and the story of Atlantis describe in the period immediately before the catastrophe. In Enoch's account, the world ruled by the Nephilim has become a place of uncontrolled violence. The Nephilim themselves are turning on each other. They have drained the earth's resources. Human civilization groans under their dominion. The heavens themselves are disturbed, and the divine council, the Watcher's own superiors, finally intervenes, sending the archangels Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel to deal with the crisis. In Plato's account, the Atlanteans, once noble and restrained, have become consumed by greed and aggression. They have launched a massive military campaign to conquer the entire Mediterranean world. The gods themselves, specifically Zeus, look down at the corruption of the Atlantean bloodline and decide that it must be dealt with. They gather in divine council to determine what to do. Two ancient texts, two different cultural traditions, both describing the same scenario, a pre-flood world in crisis, dominated by hybrid divine-human civilizations that have become dangerously out of control, prompting direct divine intervention. Now, what if these two accounts are not describing parallel events? What if they're describing the same event from different angles? What if the war that preceded the flood was not just the internal chaos of the Nephilim-ruled world described in Enoch, but an actual military conflict between the Nephilim and the Atlanteans? A war for dominance over the pre-flood Earth? Think about what the geography suggests. The Nephilim, according to the traditions that describe them, dominated the ancient Near East. The territories around the Mediterranean's eastern shores, the lands that would later become Egypt, Canaan, Mesopotamia. The Atlanteans, according to Plato, controlled territory in the Atlantic and had extended their reach into the western Mediterranean, parts of Europe, and North Africa. Their military campaign was specifically directed at the eastern Mediterranean, at Athens and Egypt. These are not two civilizations operating in separate worlds. These are two civilizations whose territories overlapped, whose spheres of influence were in direct competition, whose respective advantages, the Nephilim's raw physical power and military technology, the Atlanteans' advanced civilization and naval superiority, would have made any conflict between them an apocalyptic proposition. And here is something that almost no researcher has put together. The Egyptian priests who told Solon about Atlantis specifically mentioned that in the war between Atlantis and the eastern Mediterranean world, it was Athens that heroically resisted the Atlantean invasion. But Egypt, ancient Egypt, far older than any Egypt we know in recorded history, is described as an ally of Athens in this resistance. Why would Egypt have reason to resist the Atlanteans so fiercely, unless Egypt, or the pre-dynastic civilization that eventually became Egypt, already had a reason to oppose Atlantis? An existing conflict, a history of warfare, a territorial dispute that predated the Great Invasion. The Nephilim controlled the North African territories. The Nephilim were the dominant power in the lands that would become Egypt, and the Atlanteans were moving to conquer those lands. The resistance described in Plato's account of the Atlantean War, that courageous, seemingly impossible stand against the overwhelming power of Atlantis, may not have been purely human at all. It may have been the Nephilim, two hybrid civilizations, two branches of the same fundamental phenomenon, divine beings interbreeding with humanity and producing something extraordinary. One based in the Atlantic, refined and technological and imperial. The other based in the ancient Near East, physically overwhelming and militarily savage. And between them, a conflict that shook the foundations of the pre-flood world. What would such a war have looked like? We can only speculate, but the weapons described in the Book of Enoch, technologies of war taught by the Watcher Azazel, were far beyond anything human civilization produced for thousands of years afterward. Metals worked in ways that shouldn't have been possible. Weapons of mass destruction that the ancient texts describe in terms we might recognize as explosive or incendiary. And the Atlanteans, possessing technology that Plato describes as generations beyond their contemporaries, built on principles that we still don't fully understand, would not have been passive victims in such a conflict. What if the catastrophic geological events associated with the end of the Ice Age, the ones that seem to support the idea of a global flood, were not purely natural? What if some of them were the result of weapons used in a conflict of this scale? This is not as outlandish as it sounds. We now know, from modern research, that ancient peoples possessed far more sophisticated understanding of natural forces than we previously credited them with. We know that the end of the last ice age involved genuinely catastrophic events, not a gradual warming, but sudden violent changes that reshaped coastlines, exterminated megafauna, and flooded vast territories within human lifetimes. Some researchers have proposed that a cometary impact or series of impacts around 10,800 BC triggered these catastrophic changes, an event recorded in the geological record as the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. A sudden, violent disruption of the Earth's climate systems. Could this have been the weapon that ended the war? A force so destructive that it wiped out both sides, drowning Atlantis beneath the Atlantic, devastating the Nephilim-controlled territories of the Near East, and resetting human civilization to near zero. The divine intervention described in both the Book of Enoch and Plato's account of Zeus convening the gods. Could this be the ancient memory of forces beyond human control suddenly being brought to bear on a conflict that had gotten catastrophically out of hand? The flood, in this interpretation, was not a punishment sent from above to cleanse a sinful world. It was the consequence of a war, the environmental aftermath of a conflict between two civilizations whose weapons were powerful enough to destabilize the earth itself. And when the waters receded, when the survivors emerged from wherever they had sheltered, what was left was a world stripped of its former powers. The Nephilim largely destroyed, their numbers catastrophically reduced, the survivors scattered and diminished. Atlantis gone entirely, swallowed by the ocean, leaving nothing but the memory the Egyptian priests preserved and eventually passed to Solon. But not everything was lost, because knowledge, once acquired, doesn't simply disappear. It hides, it travels. It encodes itself in the symbols and myths and architectural traditions of the survivors. The people who rebuilt civilization after the flood, the first Egyptians, the first Sumerians, the first builders of the megalithic monuments that dot the landscape from Stonehenge to Göbekli Tepe, were not starting from scratch. They were rebuilding. They were working from memory. They were attempting to reconstruct, with reduced resources and reduced populations, something of what had existed before. Göbekli Tepe, the extraordinary stone complex discovered in southern Turkey, carbon dated to at least 10,000 BC, built by people who were supposedly still hunter-gatherers with no organized civilization, sits directly in the region associated with the Nephilim, with Mount Hermon, with the landing place of the Watchers. Who built it? Why was it deliberately buried around 8,000 BC, buried with extraordinary care, as if being preserved for future discovery? What knowledge was encoded in its pillars, its animal carvings, its precise astronomical alignments? Was it a memorial, a record, a monument to what had been lost in the war? The megalithic tradition that spread across the ancient world in the millennia after the flood, the builders of Stonehenge, of the Maltese temples, of the Peruvian stone complexes at Sacsayhuaman, of the mysterious underwater structures off the coast of Japan at Yonaguni, all seem to share a common architectural vocabulary. Similar techniques, similar astronomical alignments, similar scales of ambition that dwarf the supposed capabilities of the cultures credited with building them. As if they were all working from the same blueprint. As if they were all attempting to reconstruct the same lost knowledge. As if somewhere in the genetic or cultural memory of post-flood humanity, the echo of what came before was still strong enough to drive people to move 100-ton stones up mountainsides without machinery that we can identify. The Atlantean survivors, if they existed, would have carried their knowledge with them. Scattered across the world by the catastrophe, they would have arrived in human communities as beings of extraordinary capability, as teachers, as gods, as the divine ancestors that every post-flood civilization claims to have received its gifts of writing and agriculture and mathematics from. The Nephilim survivors, The Gibborim, the mighty ones described in Genesis as existing even after the flood, would have done the same, integrated into the rebuilding human world, sharing what remained of their inherited knowledge, becoming the god-kings and divine ancestors of the new civilizations. And in the territories that would become Egypt, the traditions of both may have merged. The Egyptian memory of Zep Tepi, the first time, may be the memory of the pre-war world, the time when both powers still existed and the knowledge they carried between them represented the height of what had ever been achieved on Earth. The secrets buried in the desert are older than we think. The chambers beneath the Giza Plateau, the ones that ground-penetrating radar suggests exist, but that official archaeology has never opened, may contain records of a world that ended before our history began. The Hall of Records that ancient Egyptian tradition insists was buried by the survivors of the Great Catastrophe, the repository of everything that was known before the flood. The accumulated knowledge of the Nephilim and the Atlanteans and the pre-flood world they dominated between them. It may still be there, waiting, in the silence beneath the sand, in the sealed archives of institutions that have no intention of opening them to the public, in the encrypted traditions of mystery schools and esoteric orders that claim, and have always claimed, to be the custodians of ancient knowledge that predates the known world. Something happened before history began. Something so vast, so violent, so completely transformative that it erased an entire chapter of human civilization and left only fragments, myths, monuments, anomalous artifacts, genetic mysteries, to hint at what existed. Two great powers, two lines of divine inheritance, an ancient war fought with weapons we can barely imagine, on a scale we can barely conceive, with consequences that are still shaping the world we live in today. The Nephilim and the Atlanteans did not simply disappear. Their war did not simply end. The knowledge they carried, the bloodlines they established, the legacy they left buried in the earth and encoded in the stars, all of it persists. Fragmented, hidden, suppressed, but not destroyed. Because the truth, like the bloodline that carries it, does not die easily. It waits. It waits in the sealed chambers and the restricted archives and the carefully guarded traditions of those who know what really happened before the flood. It waits for a world ready to hear it, and perhaps that time is finally coming.